Puritan Power, Chapter 2 from Stamped. Okay, so by now, hopefully you're saying, wow, this really isn't like the history books I'm used to. And if you aren't saying that, well, you're a liar. And guess what? You wouldn't be the first. After Gomez and Ez de Zahara ridiculous money-grabbing lie, there were other European race theorists who followed suit, using his text as a jumping-off point for their own concepts and racist ideas to justify the enslavement of Africans. Because if there's one thing we all know about humans, it's that most of us are followers, looking for something to be part of to make us feel better about our own selfishness. Or is it that just me? Just me? Got it. Anyway, the followers came sniffing around, drumming up their own cockamamie, best word ever, even better than Zahara, though possibly as synonyms, theories, to which would set the table for the conversation around racism for centuries to come. Those theories were climate theory. This actually came from Aristotle. We'll get back to him later, who questioned whether Africans were born this way or if the heat of the continent made them inferior. Many agreed it was the climate, and that if African people lived in cooler temperatures, they would in fact become white. And number 2, curse theory. In 1577, after noticing that the Inuit people in northeastern, freezing cold Canada were darker than people living in the hotter south, English travel writer George Best determined, conveniently for all parties interested in owning slaves, that it couldn't have been climate that made darker people inferior, and instead determined that Africans were in fact cursed. First of all, could you imagine someone on the Travel Channel telling you that you were cursed? Like, really? And what did Best use to improve his theory? Only one of the most infutable books of the time, the Bible. In Best's whimsical interpretation of the book Genesis, Noah orders his white sons not to have sex with their wives on the ark, and then tells them that the first child born after the flood would inherit the earth. When the evil, tyrannical, and hypersexual Ham and has sex on the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants will be dark and disgusting, and the whole world will look at them as symbols of trouble. Simply put, Ham's kids would be black and bad, ultimately making black bad. Curse theory would become the anchor that would justify American slavery. It would branch off into other ridiculous ideas. The strange concept that because Africans were cursed and because, according to these Europeans, they needed enslavement in order to be saved and civilized. The relationship between slave and master was loving, that it was more like parent and child, or minister and member, mentor, mentee. They were painting a compassionate picture about what was certainly a terrible experience because, well, human beings were being forced into servitude, and there was no way to spin that into one big happy family. But the literature said otherwise. That's right. There was another piece of literature, this one written by a man named William Perkins, called Ordering a Family, published 1590, in which he argued that the slave was just part of a loving family unit that was ordered a particular way, and that the souls and the potential of the souls were equal, but not the skin. It's like saying, I look at my dog like I look at my children, even though I've trained my dog to fetch my paper after beating it and yanking its leash. But the idea of it all let the new enslavers off the emotional hook and portrayed them as benevolent do-gooders cleaning up the Africans. A generation later, slavery touched down a newly colonized America, and the people there to usher it in, and more important, to use it to build this new country where two men, each of whom saw himself as similar kind of do-gooders. Their names were John Cotton and Richard Mather. About Cotton and Mather, they were Puritans. About Puritans, they were English Protestants who believed the Reformation of the Church of England was basically watered down Christianity, and they sought to regulate to keep it more disciplined and rigid. So these two men at different times traveled across the Atlantic in search of a new land, which would be Boston, where they could escape English persecution and preach their pure version of Christianity. They landed in America after treacherous trips, especially Richard Mather, whose ship sailed into a storm in 1635 and almost collided with the massive rock in the ocean. Mather, of course, saw his survival of this journey to America as a miracle and became even more devoted to God. Both men were ministers. They built churches in Massachusetts, but more importantly, they built systems. The church wasn't just a place of worship. The church was a place of power and influence. And in this new land, John Cotton and Richard Mather had a whole lot of power and influence. And the first thing they did to spread the Puritan way was to find other people who were like-minded. And with those like-minded folks, they created schools to enforce higher education skewed toward their way of thinking. What school do you think was the first to get the Puritan touch? This is a trick question, because the answer is very first University of America. Ever remember, this society is all brand new, and the very first university in America ever was Harvard University. But a tricky thing happens with the opening of Harvard, a thing that directly connects to Zara and the curse and climate theories and everything we've talked about thus so far. See, Cotton and Mather were students of Aristotle, and Aristotle, though held up as one of the greatest Greek philosophers of all time, famous for things we will not be discussing here because it's not a history book, believes something else he's not as nearly famous for, and that's his belief in human hierarchy. Aristotle believed that Greeks were superior to non-Greeks. John Cotton and Richard Mather took Aristotle's ideas because they too were followers and flipped it into a new equation, substituting Puritans for Greek. And because of their miraculous journeys across the raging ocean, especially Richard Mather's, they believed that they were the chosen people, special in the eyes of God. Puritan superiority. According to the Puritans, they were better than Native Americans, Anglican English people who weren't Puritans, everyone else who wasn't Puritan, and number 4, especially African people. And guess what they did during the development of Harvard? They made it so that Greek and Latin texts could not be disputed, which meant Aristotle, a man who believed in human hierarchy and used climate to justify which humans were better, could not be disputed, and instead had to be taken as truth. And just like that, the groundwork was laid, not only for slavery to be justified, but for it to be justified for a long, long time, simply because it was woven into the religious and educational systems of America. All that was needed to complete this oppressive puzzle was slaves. America at this time was like one of those games where you have to build a world, a social network of farmers and planters, and if you weren't a farmer planter, then you were a missionary. So you were either dirt folk or church folk, everyone working to grow on stolen land. Obviously, their native neighbors weren't happy about any of this because their world was being broken while a new world was being built, planted one seed at a time. The seed, tobacco. A man named John Porey, in Defender of the Course Theory, the cousin of one of the early major landowners, was named America's first legislative leaders. First thing he did was set the price of tobacco, seeing it that it would be the country's cash crop. But if tobacco was really going to bring some money, it was really going to be the natural resource used to power the country. Then they would need more human resources to grow it. See where this is going? In August 1619, a Spanish ship called the San Juan Ballesta was hijacked by two pirate ships. The Ballista was carrying 350 Anglo-Indians because Latin America slaveholders had already figured out their own slave trade system and enslaved 250,000 people. The pirates robbed the Ballista, taking 60 of the Anglo-Indians. They headed east, eventually coming upon the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. They sold the 20 Anglo-Indians to the cousin of John Porey, the one with all the land, who happened to be the governor of Virginia. His name was George Yeardley, and those first 20 slaves for Yeardley and Porey were right on time to work. But remember, America was full of planters and missionaries, and the new slaves could cause a bit of conflict between the two. For the planter, the slave was a big help, and it could be the 4-digit code to the American ATM. Here comes the cash. On the flip side, missionaries coming down the line of Puritanism and Zara's propaganda felt slavery was means to salvation. Planters wanted to grow profits, while missionaries wanted to grow God's kingdom. No one cared that the enslaved Africans wanted, which to start would have been not to be enslaved. They definitely didn't want the religion of their masters, and their masters resisted too. Enslavers weren't interested in hearing anything about converting their slaves. Saving the crops each year was more important to them than saving souls. It was harvest over humanity, and the excuses they gave to avoid baptizing slaves were: Africans were too barbaric to be converted. Africans were savage at the soul. Africans couldn't be loved, even by God. Chapter 3. A Different Adam. As I mentioned before, Zara's nonsense documentation about slave trading and the savage nature of Africans, many other Europeans started to write their own testimonies and theories. But it didn't stop with Aristotle or George Best, the travel writer. A century later, the tradition, one would go on indefinitely, of writing about African was alive and well and more creative than ever. And when I say creative, I mean trash. There was a piece in 1664 by a British minister, Richard Baxter, called A Christian Directory. Notes on Baxter. He believed slavery was helpful for African people. He even said they were voluntary slaves, as Africans who wanted to be slaves so that they could be baptized. Voluntary slaves? Richard Baxter was clearly out of his mind. There was also a work by the great English philosopher John Locke. Notes on Locke in regards to African people. He believed that the most unblemished, purest, perfect minds belonged to whites, which basically meant Africans had dirty brains. And by the Italian philosopher Lucio Vanini, notes on Vanini, he believed Africans were born of a different Adam and had different creation stories. Of course, this would mean that there were different species. It was kind of like saying, or to him proving, that Africans weren't actually humans. like they were maybe animals or monsters or aliens, but not human, at least not like whites, and therefore didn't have to be treated as such. This theory was called the Polygenesis, broke the race conversation wide open. It took Zarawa's initial benevolent master mess and put it into bold. Like Africans went from savages to savages, which revved up the necessity for Christian conversion and civilization. Pause. I know we've been going on and on about people working to justify slavery, but it's important, very important, to note that there were also people along the way who stood up and fought against these ridiculous racist ideas about abolitionist ideas. In this particular case, the case of Vanini's theory of polygenesis, a group of Mennonites in Germantown, Pennsylvania, rose up. But the Mennonites were Christian denomination from the German and Dutch-speaking areas of Central Europe. During the 16th and early 17th century, Orthodox authorities were killing them for their religious beliefs. Mennonites didn't want to leave behind one place of oppression to build another in America. So they circulated an anti-slavery petition on April 18, 1688, denouncing oppression due to skin color by equating it with oppression due to religion. Both oppressions were wrong. This petition, the 1688 Germantown Petition Against Slavery, was the first piece of writing that was anti-racist. Word check. Among European settlers in colonial America. But whenever people rise up against bad things tend to get worse. You know the old saying, when the things gets tough, the tough get racist? Or something like that. So all that anti-racist talk coming from the Mennonites was shut down because slaveholders didn't like their business talked about and it was wrong. Because they needed their slaves. Because their slaves made them money. It's really all quite simple. Now there's an obvious backdrop we need to discuss. The subject of our first grade. Color in the lines, cornucopia worksheets. The misinterpreted, misrepresented owners of this terrain, the Native Americans. All this is happening on their land. A land that was taken from them forcefully, claimed and owned by Europeans running from their homelands afraid for their lives. It's kind of like the kid who gets beat up every day at school, comes home crying to his mother, and she decides to take him to a new school. And guess what he does when he gets to the new school? He pretends like he wasn't just on the receiving end of a boot sole, and instead becomes the most annoying, tough guy in the world. The Native Americans were sick of the tough-acting, arrogant new kid. So, fight. The Native Americans and the new white American beef had been brewing for over a year. But let's be honest, it had to have been brewing much longer than that. And when I say brewing, I mean people were dying. Bloodshed in the soil. The Puritans in New England had already lost homes and dozens of soldiers, but eventually a man named Metacomet, a Native American war leader, was killed, which basically ended the battle in 1676. Puritans cut up his body, like savages, as if it were a hog's, and paraded his remains around Plymouth. But Metacomet's tribe were the only indigenous people, obviously, or the only ones being attacked. Down in Virginia, a 29-year-old frontier planter named Nathaniel Bacon. Wait, let's take a time out and acknowledge the irony of the fact that there was a planter whose last name was Bacon. Bacon. Maybe he should have been a butcher. Anyway, Bacon was upset not about the race issue, but instead about the class issue. Here he was a white laborer who was also being taken advantage by the white elite. So what he did to disrupt the powers that be was shift his anger from the rich whites to the Sasquatchanoks, a tribe of natives. This may seem like a strange move, but it was some smart play because the governor at the time, William Berkeley, was doing anything he could not to fight with the natives because it would mess up his fur trade and thus mess up his money. So attacking the natives was a way of attacking the power structure, but through the back door. And we say now, hit them in their pockets where it really hurts. And to make matters worse, Bacon declared liberty for all servants and blacks, because as far as he was concerned, though they were different races, they were the same class and should be united against the true enemy, rich whites. But the governor knew if blacks and whites joined forces, he'd be done. Everything would be done. It would have been apocalypse. So he had to devise a way to turn poor whites and poor blacks against each other so they would be forever separated and unwilling to join. Hands and raised fists against the elite. And the way he did this was by creating, wait for it, white privileges. Time for a breath break. Everyone inhale. Hold it. Exhale and breathe out. Privilege. Still here? Good. Let's move on. So white privileges were created, and at the time they included only white rebels were pardoned. Legislators prescribed 30 lashes for any slave who lifted a hand against any Christian. Christians now meant whites. All whites now wielded absolute power to abuse any African person. Those are the two most important ones. Poor whites wouldn't be punished, but they could surely do the punishing.